A mother will do anything to protect her children, even if it means facing the brutal cold alone. But what would you do if a freezing ragdoll cat showed up at your door, desperate for help? At first, Ethan thought she was just another stray trying to escape the storm. But when he realized what she was really begging for, his heart would never be the same again. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the windows of Ethan's small cabin. Snow piled high against the porch, nearly swallowing the wooden steps outside. The world beyond was a swirling, icy wasteland, silent, empty, merciless. Ethan sat alone on his couch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, a half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He had grown used to nights like these, isolated, quiet, predictable. But then, something shattered the silence. A sound, faint, almost lost beneath the storm. A cry. At first, Ethan dismissed it as the wind, but there it was again. A weak, trembling meow, barely more than a whisper against the raging blizzard. Frowning, he stood up, setting his coffee aside. He moved toward the door, pausing for just a second before unlocking it and pulling it open. The icy wind slammed into him, stinging his skin like 1,000 needles. But that wasn't what made him freeze. A cat. A ragdoll, barely standing, her long fur soaked and clumped with ice. Her blue eyes, wide with desperation, locked onto his. She wobbled forward, her body trembling violently, and with one last effort, she collapsed onto his porch. Ethan's breath caught. "What the?" He knelt beside her, reaching out. She was ice cold to the touch. Too cold. The cat lifted her head weakly, her tiny mouth opening as if to say something. A plea. But then, she tried to turn around, even with her body barely holding together. Even as she lay there on the verge of collapse, she wanted to go back. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He followed her gaze into the storm, nothing but endless white. But deep in his gut, he knew. She wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was out there. And if he didn't act fast, it might be too late. Might be. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stared at the half-conscious ragdoll cat lying at his feet. She was barely holding on, her frail body shivering uncontrollably, but still. She tried to rise, tried to go back into the storm. Hey, you can't go out there again," Ethan murmured, scooping her up carefully. She was freezing, her fur soaked, her delicate frame trembling in his arms. He could feel her ribs beneath her thick coat, as if she hadn't eaten in days. But even as she rested against him, a weak cry escaped her throat. She wasn't giving up. Something was out there. And whatever it was, it meant more to her than her own survival. Ethan clenched his jaw, looking back at the swirling white abyss outside. He had two choices. Close the door, warm up the cat, and pretend whatever was out there was not his problem. Step into the merciless storm with no guarantee he'd find anything before it was too late. The cat's tiny, desperate whimper made the decision for him. Ethan exhaled sharply, grabbed his heavy coat, and wrapped the shivering ragdoll in a thick towel before placing her near the fireplace. "You stay here. I'll find whoever you're looking for." The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a hammer. His boots sank into the knee-deep snow, and the wind roared in his ears, threatening to knock him off balance. He had lived through many harsh winters, but this was something else. How had she survived out here for so long? Each step was a battle. He shielded his face with his gloved hands, scanning the area. He had no idea where to start. The night was thick with frost and shadows, the moon barely visible through the heavy clouds. Then, a sound. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind. A muffled cry. Ethan's breath hitched. He turned toward the noise, his heart pounding. There, barely visible under the weight of the snow, a small indentation. a tiny burrow, like something had tried to dig itself in for warmth. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees. His hands plunged into the snow, digging frantically. Something was buried here. His fingers brushed against fur. His stomach clenched. Oh, God. Ethan worked faster, his heart hammering in his chest. 1, 2, 3. Kittens. Their tiny bodies were curled together, barely moving, barely breathing. They were so cold. For a second, Ethan's mind went blank. Could he even save them? Had he been too late? No. He couldn't think like that. He yanked off his scarf, carefully wrapping their fragile bodies together to trap whatever heat was left. His hands shook as he tucked them against his chest. "We're getting out of here," he muttered, turning back toward the house. His legs burned as he pushed through the snow, the storm growing stronger around him. Every second counted. Finally, his porch, his cabin, the warmth inside. The mother cat was exactly where he had left her, but the moment she saw what he carried, something in her eyes changed. She cried out. With the last of her strength, she struggled to her feet, dragging herself forward. Ethan barely had time to place the kittens in a blanket before the mother collapsed beside them, wrapping her fragile body around them, despite her own weakness. Ethan exhaled, his chest tightening. He had made it. But were they going to survive the night? Ethan's hands trembled as he stoked the fire, the warmth flickering weakly against the bitter cold outside. The mother Ragdoll lay curled protectively around her 3 kittens, their tiny bodies pressed against her for warmth. They were still. Too still. His gut twisted. "Come on, little ones," he murmured, kneeling beside them. He reached out, carefully pressing his fingers to their fragile bodies. Their fur was still damp, and their breath, so faint it was almost non-existent. They were freezing to death. Panic surged through him. He had no idea what to do. How do you save newborn kittens from hypothermia? His mind raced, but the mother cat didn't wait. She knew. Despite her exhaustion, she began licking them vigorously, her rough tongue working to stimulate warmth. Her body trembled with effort, but she didn't stop. She refused to stop. Ethan clenched his jaw. If she wasn't giving up, neither was he. He ran to the kitchen, filling a bowl with warm, not hot water. He grabbed a few soft cloths, soaking them before rushing back to the small bundle of life before him. "I don't know if this will work," he muttered, his breath shaky, "but we're going to try." Gently, he rubbed each kitten with the warm cloth, mimicking the mother's movements, carefully drying their fur while stimulating their tiny bodies. The mother looked up at him, her eyes full of pain, full of hope. Minutes passed. Nothing. Ethan's chest tightened. His hands moved faster, desperation seeping into every motion. "Come on," he whispered. "Fight." Then, a twitch. One of the kittens let out the faintest, most fragile mew Ethan had ever heard. His breath caught. Then another moved. Then the third. The mother cat let out a soft, trembling purr, nudging them closer to her chest. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his eyes burning. They were alive, but they weren't safe yet. He carefully picked up a small dropper and filled it with warm kitten formula, silently thanking whatever part of his brain had told him to keep some emergency pet supplies. One by one, he coaxed each kitten into drinking, their tiny mouths latching onto the dropper with weak but determined effort. Slowly, color returned to their small faces. Their breathing steadied. Their bodies no longer felt like ice. Ethan leaned back, running a hand down his face. He had never been a cat person. He had never considered himself a rescuer. But tonight, he was both. He looked at the mother Ragdoll, still watching him, still trusting him. For the first time, Ethan reached out and gently stroked her head. She leaned into his touch. A silent thank you. But just as he exhaled in relief, a new thought hit him. What if they weren't safe? He had saved them from the cold. But what if there was something else? Illness, malnutrition, infection. Had they been out there too long? Ethan's stomach twisted. He needed help. His gaze flickered to his phone on the counter. There was a vet in town, but in this storm, could he even get there in time? He had no choice. With one last glance at the mother and her kittens, Ethan grabbed his keys. He wasn't done saving them yet. Ethan clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he maneuvered his truck down the barely visible road. The storm was relentless, thick curtains of snow swallowing everything beyond the reach of his headlights. The tires skidded on the icy pavement, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he'd make it. But he had no choice. The mother Ragdoll and her kittens were bundled in a thick blanket beside him, their tiny bodies tucked inside his coat to keep warm. He could feel the mother trembling, her exhausted purr barely audible beneath the roaring wind outside. "Hang in there," he muttered. "Just a little longer." He had called ahead. Dr. Lillian Graves, the town's only veterinarian, had answered with a tired but firm voice. "If you can get them here, I'll do everything I can." The only problem? Getting there. A gust of wind slammed into the truck, and Ethan gritted his teeth as the tires slid dangerously close to the roadside ditch. His heart pounded. One wrong move, and they'd be stranded, with no way to save the kittens. He pressed the gas just enough to push forward, keeping his hand steady. The road signs were barely visible, but he knew the route. He had lived in this town his whole life. 10 more minutes. The mother cat let out a weak meow, pressing closer to his chest. Ethan could feel her breathing, uneven, shallow, his stomach twisted. She was fading. "Not yet," he whispered. "You have to hold on." The kittens barely made a sound. He knew that wasn't a good sign. The road curved ahead. Ethan slowed, turning carefully. His heart slammed against his ribs as the truck hit a patch of ice, spinning, sliding. "Come on! Come on!" With a sharp yank of the wheel, the truck caught traction just in time. His pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't lose them now. And then, light. A single flickering sign, barely visible through the storm. Graves Veterinary Clinic. Ethan exhaled sharply and pulled into the small parking lot. He barely had time to throw the truck into park before grabbing the bundle of fur against his chest and shoving open the door. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't care. He ran. Dr. Graves was already at the entrance, bundled in a thick sweater and boots, her graying hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Her sharp brown eyes widened as Ethan stumbled inside. "Get them to the table, now!" Ethan rushed forward, carefully unwrapping the blanket. The mother cat let out a faint cry as the doctor examined her, then turned her attention to the 3 kittens. "They were buried in the snow," Ethan said breathlessly. "I got to them in time, but they were barely breathing." Dr. Graves didn't respond. She worked fast, checking their vitals, wrapping them in warm towels, placing tiny IVs in their fragile legs. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to her. Minutes passed. Then more. Ethan barely realized he was holding his breath until Dr. Graves finally stepped back, exhaling. "They're alive." Ethan's knees nearly gave out. "But," she continued, leveling him with a serious look, "it's going to be a fight. The mother is severely malnourished and exhausted. The kittens are weak. If you hadn't brought them in when you did—" She shook her head. "They wouldn't have made it." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "What happens now?" Dr. Graves gave him a long look. "They need constant care, warmth, food, round-the-clock monitoring. It won't be easy." Ethan nodded, already knowing what she was about to say. "Are you willing to take that on?" He looked at the mother cat, her blue eyes barely open but still full of silent trust. The kittens, weak but breathing, curled into her side. Ethan exhaled. I didn't come this far to let them go now. Dr. Graves smiled. Then let's get to work. The small veterinary clinic was quiet, except for the soft hum of a heating lamp and the faint, rhythmic breathing of the mother cat and her kittens. Ethan sat beside the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of steaming coffee, watching as Dr. Graves carefully monitored the tiny family. They're stable for now, she said finally, glancing at him. But the next 24 hours are critical. If they make it through the night, their chances will improve. Ethan nodded, his eyes locked on the mother Ragdoll. She had barely moved since he had brought her in, but her body curled protectively around her kittens. Even in her weakened state, she refused to let them go. He exhaled. What else can I do? Dr. Graves smiled slightly. You already did the hard part. You saved them. She adjusted the blanket covering the kittens and stood. They'll need warmth, food, and hydration. I'll do everything I can, but they'll need someone to care for them around the clock. Ethan hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want to help, but he had never raised kittens before, let alone fragile, half-frozen newborns. Dr. Graves must have sensed his hesitation. You don't have to decide now, she said gently. But if they pull through, they'll need a home. Ethan looked down at the mother cat, remembering the way she had stumbled through the snow, refusing to stop until she had led him to her babies. She had chosen to trust him. Could he really walk away now? Before he could respond, the smallest kitten let out a faint mew, barely more than a whisper of sound. The mother cat nudged it gently, her blue eyes flickering open for a moment. Ethan's chest tightened. All right, he murmured. What do I need to do? Dr. Graves gave a satisfied nod. First, let's get them home. The drive back was slower, the storm having eased slightly, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind raced with everything Dr. Graves had told him. Keep them warm, feed them every 2 hours, watch for any signs of distress. He wasn't sure how he was going to do this, but as he pulled into his driveway and carefully carried the mother and her kittens inside, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to fail them. He set up a soft bed near the fireplace, layering warm blankets and a heating pad beneath them. The mother cat let out a weak purr as he settled them down, curling tightly around her kittens. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His home had always been quiet, too quiet. Now, as he listened to the soft breathing of the little family he had saved, it didn't feel so empty anymore. Ethan had always thought of himself as someone who preferred solitude. His life had been built around quiet routines. Work, home, sleep, repeat. No pets, no attachments, nothing that could shake the stability of his small, predictable world. But now, as he sat on the floor of his living room, watching over a fragile mother cat and her 3 tiny kittens, he realized how much things had changed in just 24 hours. The mother Ragdoll, whom he had started calling Luna, was curled up in the soft blankets by the fireplace, her kittens tucked against her warm body. She was still weak, but her breathing was steady, her purring a soft vibration in the silent room. Ethan let out a slow breath. He had gotten them through the storm, through the desperate fight for survival, but now came the hardest part, keeping them alive. Ethan had barely slept. Dr. Graves had warned him. Newborn kittens needed constant attention. Every 2 hours they had to be fed, kept warm, and watch for any signs of distress. It was exhausting, but Ethan didn't hesitate. Each time his alarm buzzed in the middle of the night, he pushed aside his exhaustion and got up. He would check on Luna first, making sure she was drinking the special recovery formula the vet had given him. She barely moved when he approached, but her blue eyes always flickered open, watching him. Then came the kittens. Tiny, fragile, barely able to move on their own, they needed warmth and nutrition to survive. Luna was doing her best to nurse them, but she was weak, and Ethan had to step in. One by one, He fed them small amounts of milk from a dropper, holding them carefully in his hands, feeling their tiny hearts beat against his fingers. He never thought something so small could feel so important. By the time the sun rose, Ethan was exhausted, but he didn't regret a single second. He had saved them. Now, he just had to keep saving them. Over the next few days, something strange happened. Luna, who had been wary of him at first, started to change. At first it was subtle, just the way her ears would perk up when he entered the room, or the way her tail curled slightly when he reached out to adjust her blankets. Then one evening, as he sat beside her, making sure the kittens were nursing properly, she did something that caught him completely off guard. She rubbed her head against his hand. Ethan froze. Luna looked up at him, her blue eyes calm, her body pressed against his palm. A silent thank you. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and gently ran his fingers through her fur. "You're going to be okay," he murmured. "All of you." Luna purred, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something deep in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Connection. By the end of the first week, the kittens had begun to change. Their tiny bodies had gained strength, their movements less sluggish. Their fur, once damp and clumped from the cold, now fluffed out in soft waves. And then, their eyes opened. Ethan had never considered himself an emotional man, but when he saw those tiny blue eyes blinking up at him for the first time, his chest tightened. "They're gonna make it," he muttered, more to himself than to Luna. She responded with a soft meow, as if she had known all along. Ethan knew then that he had never been just a temporary shelter for them. They had found a home. Ethan had never planned on being a caretaker, let alone for a family of fragile newborn kittens and their devoted mother. But as the days turned into weeks, something inside him shifted. His house, once quiet and almost lifeless, now hummed with the soft sounds of tiny paws against the wooden floors, the gentle purring of Luna, and the occasional high-pitched mew of the kittens as they discovered their voices. He had done everything in his power to make sure they survived, waking up at odd hours to feed them, adjusting the blankets by the fire, making sure Luna was strong enough to care for them. And now, as he watched them tumble over each other in clumsy play, he realized he had done more than just keep them alive. They were thriving. Luna had fully regained her strength. Her coat, once dull and matted from the cold, now gleamed in the firelight, soft and thick. She still watched Ethan with those deep blue eyes, still carried a quiet wisdom that made him wonder about the life she had lived before she had come to him. The kittens had grown into little bundles of energy, chasing each other across the floor, pouncing on anything that moved, including Ethan's fingers whenever he dared to dangle them in front of them. Each had their own personality, one bold and adventurous, one timid and shy, and the last, the smallest of the three, always curling up beside Luna, never straying too far. Ethan had started calling them by names without even realizing it. Ash, Willow, and Finn. They weren't just names anymore. They were family. But as much as he had come to love them, a nagging thought had begun to creep into his mind. What happens now? He knew Dr. Graves had assumed he'd take care of them temporarily, just long enough to nurse them back to health before finding them homes. That was always the plan, wasn't it? One evening, as he sat on the couch with Luna stretched beside him, her head resting lightly against his leg, the question pressed harder against his chest. "You're expecting me to give you all up, aren't you?" he muttered, scratching behind her ears. Luna lifted her head slightly, blinking at him. She didn't move away. If anything, she pressed closer. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You were never supposed to stay." The words felt wrong as he said them, because deep down, he knew the truth. They had to stay. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This wasn't just survival. It was home. Ethan picked up his phone, dialing Dr. Graves' number. She answered almost immediately, her voice warm and knowing. "I was wondering when you'd call." Ethan huffed a laugh. "Yeah? You've made your decision, haven't you?" He looked down at Luna, at the kittens curled in a heap by the fireplace, their tiny chests rising and falling with each peaceful breath. "Yeah," he said softly. "I have." Dr. Graves chuckled. "I had a feeling. They chose you, Ethan. And if I'm being honest, I think you needed them just as much as they needed you." Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. Maybe she was right. Maybe that cold night, when Luna had appeared at his door, wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it had been fate. As he hung up the phone, Luna stretched her paw out, resting it gently on his arm. Ethan smiled, brushing his fingers over her fur. "Guess that settles it," he murmured. He had saved them. But in the end, they had saved him too. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. Sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us in return.